Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. The message from Republican Mitch McConnell at the Munich Security Conference last week, I would contrast with a statement made by Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, a putative 2024 presidential contender on the Republican side. Here's him talking on Fox and Friends.
Well, they have effectively a blank check policy with no clear strategic objective identified. And these things can escalate, and I don't think it's in our interest to be getting into proxy war with China getting involved over things like the borderlands or over Crimea. So I think it would behoove them to identify what is the strategic objective that they're trying to achieve. But just saying it's an open-ended blank check, that is not acceptable.
Okay, what do you make of this? It does seem to me that we are still a long way from the 2024 election and even the Republican primaries. And so there's a lot that could change on the ground in Ukraine that could alter people's perceptions. But it does seem to me like we are getting the beginnings of a Republican debate over foreign policy.
Yeah, Kyle, we've also seen polling in the last several months show that Republicans are growing more skeptical over time and think that we may be doing too much for Ukraine. I'd say a couple things about the DeSantis criticism. The first one is that he has a point that the Biden administration is not really articulating what a strategy is. And we've been writing on our pages about the strategy being to evict other Russians and win the war. The Biden administration is not saying that, and they're not rooting their arguments for assisting Ukraine in the core U.S. national interest. I really don't want to hear the phrase rules-based international order again. We really should be talking about why, for instance, Russia is working with Iran and China to try to wage this war, and it is forming basically an axis against the United States. We've learned a lot about our enemies over the past year. I also think the blank check argument is a bit of a straw man. We've spent real money on Ukraine, but we also have managed to accomplish a lot without putting any U.S. troops in harm's way and not having any U.S. deaths. And so we are degrading an enemy power at a lower cost to the United States. The last thing I'll just get in here, Kyle, is that this idea there is kind of a hobby horse about how no one knows where any of this money is going. There are multiple U.S. government IGs who have, by my last check, 64 ongoing or planned projects on oversight in Ukraine aid. Now, some of this aid is economic aid, humanitarian aid. Those kind of programs have been vulnerable to being just wasted or misused, and there will be some of that in our aid to Ukraine. And I think our aid should focus more on long-range missiles and security assistance that can win the war quickly. But this is not to say that we simply have no idea what we've spent or where it's going. It is being tracked. Some of it may be misused, but there's war going on, and so some of that will be inevitable. But I just don't think we should buy into this argument that our only options are it's a blank check and we don't have a plan. There's very much an opening here for a Republican who wants to root the case for helping Ukraine in a core U.S. national interests and it being a good use of U.S. money, a good bang for your buck.
To the point about the axis that may be forming here up against the United States, also recent news that Chinese leader Xi Jinping is planning to visit Moscow in recent months. And then over the weekend, Secretary of State Antony Blinken told CBS this: the concern that we have now is based on information we have that they're considering providing lethal support. We've made very clear to them that that would cause a serious problem for us and in our relationship. Unquote. And Joe, I mean, you've covered not only Europe, but also Asia. What's your view of the relationship between these two leaders and President Xi's interest in getting involved in a land war in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, certainly historically, there's never been an awful lot of love lost between China and Russia before the current government, the Soviet Union, although I think we should not read too much into that because they also have a very strong sensibility about the enemy of their enemy being their friend. And in that instance, the enemy is the U.S. I am a bit perplexed by the suggestion that now they are pushing ahead with plans for a Xi-Putin summit only because there had been a sense in the earlier phase of the war that people in Beijing were starting to think that Xi had made a mistake in early February of last year when he had a summit with Putin and declared an enduring friendship between the two countries, which was viewed as China giving its blessing for the coming Ukraine invasion. And after that, it had appeared that people were starting to think, including potentially Xi himself, that that had been a mistake, that it was not in China's interest to become embroiled in something that very clearly was looking much like a Russian loss. And so I think that we have to worry a little bit if China now might be concluding that actually there is some profit to them of continuing to support the war effort, because the real issue here has to be what lessons are Beijing extracting from this episode about what might happen if they invade Taiwan within the next few years. And so it would not be reassuring if we start getting signs that China thinks that actually Western resolve is fickle in an event like this, or that it's possible to create divisions within the Western alliance, when in fact we should be hoping that we could drive a wedge of some sort between China and Russia. And that might still be possible, but this is a sign that we are going to have to continue working at it.
Finally, one last bit of breaking news this morning. At the end of a 100-minute speech, President Putin of Russia said that he was suspending the New START nuclear arms control treaty. And he didn't say that he was pulling out of the treaty. It officially expires in 2026. He also didn't say that he was going to build weapons over the cap that is applied to the U.S. or Russia. But he said that he was not going to allow inspections. And Kate, if inspections are the way to verify that the treaty is being upheld, and the U.S. has recently also said that it doesn't think that Russia is upholding its end, how worried should people be about Putin's unilateral suspension here of the treaty that he is apparently not following anyway?
Right. So when the U.S. State Department came out recently and said that the Russians were not allowing inspections, I thought GOP Senator Jim Risch put it pretty well when he said that Russia's behavior is, quote, a surprise to no one. I think they have a long history here of basically evading their commitments. The other detail about this is, in addition to the inspections, the U.S. and Russia are supposed to have periodic meetings. And there was one set up and Russia just, took it off the Google Calendar and hasn't been willing to reschedule. So the State Department said, we don't think that they went over the warhead limits prescribed in the agreement, but since we don't have inspections, we can't say for certain. So I don't think this is a big surprise, but it is the continuation of just the collapse of the Cold War arms control architecture. And we've been writing for a long time that any nuclear arms agreement that doesn't include China is not a useful one. And so there is an opportunity here for something much better to replace it. But I think this is really not a surprise based on everything we know about Putin and Russia and their long history of trying to not follow up on their arms control commitments.
Joe, we'll give you the last word. My 2 cents is that I'm not putting my faith in arms control agreements to keep the United States safe. I'm putting my faith in peace through strength and deterrence. And so if Russia is cheating on this treaty, then maybe it ought to be suspended and we fall back on those traditional tools of having a strong military and a military that Vladimir Putin ought to be afraid of, frankly. We should not be afraid of him as much as he is afraid of us.
Well, I think that the historical context for some of these arms control agreements can really give you clues about what an event like this means. And so, the New START, which is the treaty that we're talking about now, that Russia is casting to the side, is, I think, the second or third generation of a line of nuclear arms control treaties going back to the 80s. And it's important to remember that during the Cold War, especially in the late 70s and into the Reagan years, these treaties were only half of the picture. This was the carrot, whereas the stick was the increase in military spending in the West, things like placing the Pershings in Western Europe, exerting a lot of pressure there. And then the treaties became a useful means of giving the Soviet Union a way to negotiate out of the pressure that the West was ratcheting up. And so you couldn't really separate the one from the other when you were looking at the strategy that was so successful in that era and ending the Cold War. And I think that it's worth remembering that now, too, that, certainly the New START can only be effective as a carrot if there is also a stick behind it. And I think that the stick at this moment would probably be keeping up the pressure in Ukraine by providing the Ukrainians with the means that they need to defend themselves and inflict losses on Russia, so that then Russia has the incentive to come back to the negotiating table, whether that's in Ukraine directly or with some of these other arms control issues.
Thank you, Joe and Kate. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, hit that subscribe button, and we'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.